At 37,000 feet over Indonesia, a Boeing 747 lost thrust from all 4 engines. There was no fuel shortage, the airplane had not struck another aircraft, and no warning had identified a shared mechanical fault. One engine surged and stopped, then a second failed. Then the remaining 2 went quiet. British Airways Flight 9 had become a glider in darkness, with mountains between it and the nearest runway. The cockpit still contained instruments, checklists, and 3 experienced flight crew members. What it did not contain was an explanation. Outside the windscreen, blue-white electrical discharges had danced across the glass. A strange haze had entered the cabin. The engine inlets had glowed. Those clues belonged to a hazard that commercial crews were not yet trained to recognize as one event. Below the aircraft was roughly 25,000 feet of usable altitude. Ahead was Jakarta. Behind was open water. Every restart attempt traded height for another chance to recover power. If enough engines did not return by 12,000 feet, the crew's remaining option would be to turn back toward the sea and prepare hundreds of people for a night ditching. Flight 9 was operating the Kuala Lumpur to Perth leg of a longer British Airways service on June 24, 1982. The aircraft was GBDXH, a 747-236B named City of Edinburgh. Its 4 Rolls-Royce RB211 engines were designed to produce thrust independently. A single failure was manageable. The near-simultaneous loss of all 4 demanded a cause shared by the air flowing through them. Captain Eric Moody, Senior First Officer Roger Greaves, and Senior Flight Engineer Barry Townley Freeman had taken over in Kuala Lumpur. The classic 747 flight deck divided work among 3 people. 1 flew, 1 handled communications and navigation, and the engineer monitored the aircraft's systems and engines. That division became essential when ordinary checklists no longer matched the scale of the failure. The night ahead had looked clear. There was no moon to reveal texture in the atmosphere, and no radar return announcing the cloud in their path. The aircraft was cruising normally after passing the Jakarta area. The first change was not a warning light. It was an atmosphere that looked and smelled wrong. Static discharge began to crawl across the windscreen. Sten Elmo's fire can appear when charged particles build a strong electrical field around an aircraft. In this case, the display intensified into bright streaks. The engine inlets seemed illuminated from within. Dust or smoke entered through the ventilation system with an acrid, ionized smell. Crew members used oxygen as the cabin environment deteriorated. Each cue could be mistaken for something else when considered alone. Electrical discharge can accompany thunderstorms. An odor can suggest an electrical or ventilation fault. Haze can resemble smoke. An orange-white inlet glow can look like combustion trouble within one engine. Together, however, the signs described millions of charged, abrasive mineral particles striking the aircraft and entering every operating engine. Modern volcanic ash guidance lists almost this exact group of symptoms: dust or smoke in the cockpit, an acrid or sulfurous odor, static discharge around the windscreen, changing engine indications, and a glow in the inlets. Flight 9 encountered the pattern before that pattern had become routine training. Engine number 4 surged first. A surge means stable airflow through the compressor has broken down, pressure can pulse forward, and combustion can become unstable. The crew completed the immediate drill. Before that single failure could be contained as a normal event, no 2 surged and stopped. Nose 3 and 1 followed in quick succession. The sequence turned an engine problem into a total loss of thrust emergency. First Officer Greaves transmitted a mayday to Jakarta, reporting that all 4 engines had failed. Static and poor radio quality made the message difficult to understand. The controller initially heard it as a report that engine number 4 had failed. A crew on another aircraft relayed the meaning, not one engine but every engine. That misunderstanding mattered because 4-engine failure changed the geometry of every clearance. The 747 could not hold altitude. It needed room to descend, a route that respected terrain, and repeated restart attempts. Air traffic control could clear the airspace, but it could not supply the one fact the crew needed most: why 4 healthy engines had stopped together. Mount Galunggung lies in West Java, southeast of Jakarta. It had been active during 1982, and a new eruption began roughly 2 hours before Flight 9 reached the area. Ash rose into airspace used by long-range jets and moved downwind. The crew did not receive a warning that placed a hazardous plume across their route. This was not simply a dark thundercloud overlooked on radar. Volcanic ash consists of fragments of rock, mineral, and volcanic glass. The particles may be suspended in a cloud that resembles ordinary weather, especially at night. Airborne weather radar is designed mainly to detect precipitation-sized water and ice. It does not reliably reveal dry ash at useful operational ranges. The absence of a radar image therefore did not mean the air was clear. It meant the available sensor was looking for a different physical target. Flight 9 crossed an information boundary first and an ash boundary second. By the time the crew could see the effects, the particles were already inside the engines. The word ash makes the material sound soft. Aviation ash is not. Individual particles can have sharp edges and glassy mineral content. At high speed, they erode paint, lights, windows, leading edges, compressor blades, and probes. A 747 moving through a dense plume becomes both a collector and a target, exposing a huge frontal area to abrasive material every second. The damage changes with temperature. In the cooler front sections of an engine, particles scour rotating and stationary components. Farther inside, combustion raises temperatures high enough for silicate-bearing material to soften or melt. The material can then adhere to hot turbine and nozzle guide vane surfaces instead of passing harmlessly through the exhaust. The threat is therefore 2 mechanisms at once. Abrasion removes material where the flow is cool, while molten deposits add material where the flow is hot. Both change carefully designed shapes and clearances. One scratches away visibility, the other constricts the path an engine needs to breathe. A turbofan depends on continuous organized flow. The fan and compressor raise pressure, fuel burns in the combustor. Expanding gas crosses turbine stages that drive the compressor and fan. Every blade row and nozzle area is sized so pressure and temperature change without forcing the compressor out of its stable operating range. Ash deposits disturbed that balance. The most consequential restriction was found around the first stage high-pressure turbine nozzle guide vanes. Reducing the available throat area increased back pressure through the hot section. The compressor could no longer sustain normal flow at cruise power. Surging followed, combustion became unstable, and the engines flamed out. 4 separate engines shared the same atmosphere and operating condition. They did not need a common fuel or control failure. Each ingested the same damaging material, each accumulated deposits, and each crossed its stability limit within minutes of the others. In 1982, the warning system around the airplane was incomplete. The volcano could erupt faster than observations moved through agencies. The plume could reach a jet route before a useful advisory reached dispatchers, controllers, and pilots. The aircraft's own weather radar could not close that gap. Today, avoidance is the central defense. Procedures tell crews not to treat a visible gap or weak radar return as permission to penetrate known ash. If an encounter occurs, guidance generally calls for leaving the cloud, reducing thrust when conditions permit, using continuous ignition, and reporting the hazard immediately. Those actions reduce exposure and improve the chance that other aircraft will avoid the same air. Flight 9 had to discover the hazard from inside it. The crew's first successful safety action was not a diagnosis. It was continuing to fly the aircraft, establish a controlled descent, and keep trying the engines while the evidence remained confusing. With thrust gone, Flight 9 settled into a glide. A 747 does not fall vertically when its engines stop. Forward speed keeps air moving over the wings, and altitude becomes the energy source that maintains that speed. The crew can trade height for distance, but the exchange is irreversible. Every mile consumes part of the remaining vertical reserve. The aircraft began near 37,000 feet. The crew stabilized the descent and turned back toward Jakarta while the flight engineer and pilots cycled through restart attempts. Below them, the Java coast and high ground constrained the approach. A successful restart had to arrive early enough to clear terrain, not merely before reaching the sea surface. The planned decision point was flight level 120. If adequate power had not returned by then, continuing inland would risk meeting mountains without climb capability. The alternative was to reverse course toward open water and prepare for ditching while some altitude remained. Communication became another technical problem. Static interfered with radio reception, and the aircraft was moving lower relative to controllers and terrain. Jakarta could organize airspace only from the information that reached it. The crew had to repeat and relay the seriousness of the emergency while carrying out engine procedures. Inside the cabin, loss of normal pressurization allowed cabin altitude to rise. Passenger oxygen masks deployed. On the flight deck, the crew used oxygen masks, which made conversation more difficult. A briefing with the cabin service director could not proceed normally because masked speech and workload reduced what could be exchanged. The emergency was not one dramatic task. It was a stack. Fly the glide, turn toward a possible airport, compare terrain with altitude, attempt 4 engine restarts, monitor pressurization, manage oxygen, communicate with controllers, and prepare the cabin for outcomes that changed with every 1,000 feet. Some systems behaved differently from the crew's simulator expectation. The loss of engine thrust did not immediately produce the complete electrical collapse associated with a standard all-engine-out exercise. The captain's autopilot remained available, reducing part of the physical flying workload during the descent. That did not make the airplane normal. Independent airspeed indications began to disagree. Navigation information degraded. Ash contamination and changing pressure sources affected systems the crew normally trusted to describe motion through the air. A 50-knot disagreement is not a small instrument error, when pitch, glide speed, terrain, and restart procedures all depend on reliable energy information. The crew cross-checked what remained rather than choosing one failing indication. Redundancy works only when failures remain independent. A cloud spread across the entire aircraft can attack multiple probes, windows, engines, and sensors at once, turning several backups into versions of the same environmental exposure. Restarting a turbine engine in flight requires airflow, ignition, fuel, and a rotating core within acceptable limits. The descending aircraft supplied windmilling airflow. The crew selected ignition and worked through attempts across the 4 engines. For many minutes, nothing restored sustained thrust because the same hot section restriction remained. Repetition was rational even without a diagnosis. Conditions were changing continuously as the airplane descended and moved through the plume. Air density increased, engine temperature changed. The aircraft's position relative to the ash changed. A restart that failed at one altitude and contamination level could succeed later. This is why the procedure did not end after one unsuccessful cycle. The crew had 4 independent chances, a shrinking altitude reserve, and no better means of removing the obstruction. Each attempt tested whether the physical state inside an engine had changed enough to sustain flow again. After roughly 12 minutes of descent, Flight 9 emerged from the ash cloud near 13,000 feet. The visual environment cleared before the engine problem did. The crew continued the restart sequence. Near 12,500 feet, engine number 4 came back to life. One engine changed the problem immediately. It reduced the rate of descent, bought time, and proved that the failures were reversible under the new conditions. About a minute later, number 3 restarted, followed rapidly by the remaining engines. For the first time since the Mayday, the 747 could hold altitude around flight level 120. The recovery did not erase the earlier damage. A restarted engine was an operating damaged engine, not a restored factory engine. The crew still needed terrain clearance, communications, navigation, and a landing through windows already being abraded by the same material that had stopped the turbines. The likely reason the engines could restart was physical, not mysterious. When combustion stopped, hot deposits began to cool. Material fused onto nozzle guide vanes could solidify and become brittle. Repeated restart attempts and renewed airflow could shake or break away part of that obstruction. Lower altitude also meant denser air. An engine with reduced effective flow area and damaged surfaces could operate under conditions different from those at high-altitude cruise. Exiting the densest ash prevented immediate reaccumulation. Enough flow returned for combustion to stabilize, even though efficiency and component condition remained degraded. No single factor guarantees this outcome. Cooling alone is not a restart procedure, and every ash encounter differs in concentration, duration, engine type, and damage. On Flight 9, the combination of leaving the cloud, descending, cooling, deposit shedding, and persistent restart attempts created a temporary path back to thrust. With power restored, the crew chose to continue toward Jakarta and climb for additional terrain clearance and stronger radio contact. The climb took the aircraft back toward contaminated air. Seen Elmo's fire returned. Engine number 2 began surging violently. This second encounter demonstrated how narrow the recovery was. The engines had not become immune to ash. Higher thrust and renewed particle ingestion could rebuild the same unstable conditions. The crew shut down number 2 and left the ash again, using the remaining 3 engines. From that point, avoiding another high-power ash exposure shaped the descent. The crew used speed brakes, landing gear, and flap configuration to control energy without simply pulling the operating engines to idle. Their goal was to keep stable power while getting below the contaminated layer and toward the airport. 3 engines were enough to fly the 747 to Halim Perdana Airport, but the route had to be flown with degraded navigation and poor external visibility. The crew reached the airport area, identified the runway environment, and set up for runway 26. The aircraft had survived the power emergency only to reveal a second consequence. Ash had scoured the main windscreens until most of their external surface was opaque. Landing lights were on, but their covers had also been abraded, turning useful beams into diffuse glare. A safe landing now depended on instruments, crew coordination, and the small portions of the outside world still visible through the damaged glass. The airplane could produce thrust again. The crew still had to place it on a runway they could barely see. On final approach, almost nothing useful could be seen through the main windscreen area. A narrow vertical strip near the left edge remained clearer. Through it, the captain could make out visual approach slope lights beside the runway. The first officer and flight engineer supported the approach with distance and altitude calls. This was not a normal visual landing and not a fully automatic solution. The crew combined instrument alignment, radio altitude information, distance, a thin visual reference, and coordinated callouts. Near the threshold, airport lights spread across the damaged glass as glare rather than resolving into a clear runway picture. The main landing gear touched the runway in calm conditions. Flight 9 decelerated, left the runway, and taxied with the same restricted forward view. Nobody aboard had been injured. The landing ended the immediate emergency but exposed what the ash had done to almost every forward-facing surface. On the ground, the aircraft looked sandblasted. Paint and metal on the nose, wing leading edges, and engine nacelles showed abrasion. Windshields and landing light covers had lost transparency. Ash contamination affected probes and contributed to unreliable instrument indications. Inside the engines, damage told a different part of the story. Turbine blade tips were eroded. Silicate-rich material had fused to hot metal. Deposits restricted the nozzle guide vane area. The engine that was shut down after the second ash encounter retained heavier deposits than engines repeatedly restarted and kept operating. That comparison supported the restart explanation. Operating and restart cycles had shed some cooled, brittle material from 3 engines, while the shutdown engine preserved more of the obstruction. The aircraft itself had become a record of the cloud's path through cold surfaces, sensors, compressors, combustors, and turbines. Flight 9 is often remembered for the calm passenger announcement that all 4 engines had stopped. The deeper achievement was not the wording. It was the crew's ability to keep making bounded decisions without knowing the cause, stabilize the descent, communicate, protect breathing, compare altitude with terrain, repeat restarts, abandon one damaged engine, and complete a nearly blind approach. None of those decisions makes volcanic ash safe. The outcome depended on altitude, geography, weather, engine response, and the chance that enough deposits would shed. A denser plume, lower encounter, different wind, or unsuccessful restart could have produced a very different ending. The absence of casualties should not hide the severity. 4 engines had failed. The aircraft lost 25,000 feet. Terrain narrowed its options. Major systems and visibility were degraded. Survival turned the encounter into evidence before a fatal accident forced the industry to learn the same lesson. The event also showed why a successful landing is not the end of a safety investigation. Engineers needed to understand a failure mode that crossed meteorology, air traffic information, materials, engines, aircraft systems, and crew procedures. Treating it as an unusual engine event would miss the shared source. British Airways, Rolls-Royce, and Indonesian aviation personnel examined the aircraft and available operational record. No widely available public Annex 13 report followed, so the detailed chronology survives through industry technical work and crew accounts rather than one definitive public accident dossier. That evidence limitation must remain visible. The engine damage mechanism is strongly supported by physical inspection and later ash research. Some exact timing and cockpit details come from technically competent reconstructions. The lesson is not strengthened by pretending every detail carries the same documentary weight. Flight 9 was not the last Galunggung encounter. Weeks later, another 747 met ash from the same volcano and suffered multiple engine failures. In 1989, KLM Flight 867 lost thrust from all 4 engines after entering ash from Alaska's Mount Redoubt. These events made clear that the hazard was global and repeatable. A volcano does not have to sit beside an airport. High-altitude winds can carry ash across international routes and national boundaries. An eruption can develop faster than a distant airline or controller can assess it. The aircraft that first observes the cloud may already be too close to avoid it. The solution, therefore, could not live only inside one cockpit checklist. It required observatories, meteorologists, satellites, advisory centers, air traffic services, dispatchers, and crews to share one operational picture quickly enough for avoidance. ICAO issued interim guidance in 1982 for distributing volcanic ash information. Formal international requirements followed in 1987 through the International Airways Volcano Watch. The system defined how observations and forecasts should move toward the people making flight decisions. 9 volcanic ash advisory center regions now divide global responsibility. A center uses observations, satellite data, weather models, and reports to analyze where ash exists and where winds may carry it. Advisories feed meteorological offices, air traffic systems, airlines, and pilots. The network does not make ash harmless and does not turn every plume boundary into a perfectly measured wall. It improves the chance that an aircraft will never need to repeat Flight 9's experiment. The most effective engine protection is still keeping the engine out of ash. Current guidance begins with recognition. Ash may appear as ordinary cloud or haze. Weather radar may not detect it. Static discharge, odor, dust, inlet glow, engine temperature changes, surging, and reduced visibility are warning signs that demand immediate action. Where terrain and operating procedures permit, crews are generally directed to leave the cloud, often by reversing course, reduce thrust to limit ash accumulation, use continuous ignition, configure bleed systems as required, and report the encounter. Controllers treat a report of distress in ash as an emergency and avoid issuing advice that assumes radar can define a safe escape path. These procedures are written in the language of limits, because ash concentration and engine tolerance cannot be inferred precisely from the cockpit. The objective is not to find a power setting that makes penetration acceptable. It is to minimize dose and exit. Modern satellites add something Flight 9 did not have: repeated views of remote eruptions and ash movement. Ground observatories remain essential, but many active volcanoes are not monitored continuously on site. Space-based sensors can identify eruption signatures and help estimate plume position where no observer has a direct view. Forecasting then turns observation into a moving operational picture. Wind changes altitude by altitude, so ash released from one volcano can separate into layers with different directions and speeds. Advisory boundaries must be updated as the atmosphere moves them. The system is deliberately redundant. A satellite detection, pilot report, volcano observatory notice, and model forecast can reinforce one another. No single sensor has to carry the entire warning chain, and a pilot report can protect the next aircraft even when an eruption was previously unknown. Flight 9 also changed how volcanic ash is described to crews. The danger is not only visibility and not only an engine flameout. Ash can abrade windows and lights, contaminate probes, damage compressors and turbines, interfere with instruments, enter ventilation systems, and create expensive damage even when every engine keeps running. Exposure is cumulative. Concentration matters, but so do time, engine power, particle composition, and temperature. A lower density cloud encountered for longer can still produce a significant dose. A short, dense encounter can overwhelm an engine before a crew fully understands the signs. This is why a successful transit is not proof that a route was safe. Damage may be hidden inside hot sections and reveal itself only during inspection. Avoidance protects both immediate flight and the engine life that remains afterward. The crew of Flight 9 did not solve the emergency by identifying a volcano. They solved the parts they could control. They kept the aircraft stable, they descended through the hazard, they made the terrain decision explicit. They repeated restart attempts as conditions changed. They abandoned an engine when renewed surging made it unsafe. They coordinated a landing through damaged windows. The institutional response solved a different problem, making sure later crews would not begin with the same absence of information. Detection, advisories, reporting procedures, training, and engine research turned an extraordinary event into a recognizable hazard category. Those two forms of safety operate at different times. Crew skill manages the event already happening. System design tries to prevent the event from reaching the crew at all. Flight 9 survived because the first form worked under extreme conditions. Its lasting value came from strengthening the second. GBDXH was repaired and returned to service. The engines and damaged components could be replaced. The information exposed by the encounter could not be put back into the old system. A jet route near an active volcano was no longer merely a weather problem. It was an international aviation safety problem. The aircraft's survival gave investigators rare physical evidence from all 4 engines: the airframe, the windows, probes, and lights. It showed the same particles changing behavior failure across temperatures and locations. It showed why an aircraft could lose every engine, recover some thrust, and still arrive with damage spread far beyond the turbines. Most importantly, it showed that the first warning might come from the aircraft already inside the cloud. The warning architecture built afterward was designed to move that moment earlier, from engine surge to cockpit queue, from cockpit queue to advisory, from advisory to forecast, and from forecast to a route that never enters the ash. British Airways Flight 9 landed because altitude, repeated action, changing conditions, and crew coordination created a path through a failure nobody aboard had been trained to expect. All 4 engines stopped. Enough of them restarted. The windows did not recover, the damage did not disappear, and the outcome was never guaranteed. The event remains useful because it links a spectacular symptom to an ordinary engineering principle. Machines depend on the environment assumed around them. Change the material flowing through an engine, and independent engines can fail together. Change how that material behaves with temperature, and a blocked engine may later restart without becoming undamaged. No one aboard Flight 9 was killed or injured. The permanent memorial is therefore not a list of victims, it is the warning system that followed. Observe the volcano, track the ash, tell the aircraft, and keep the route outside the cloud.